2020 marked the beginning of a new console generation, and due to competing needs for parts and some Old Testament type shenanigans from the big man upstairs, the new consoles have been hard to come by. Not since the launch of the Wii has constraint on console supply been so apparent. Sony, in particular, expects shortages to last for many months to come. It's a bummer for everyone involved, especially those who have been unsuccessful thus far in acquiring one of the new machines. But really, for those in countries like the US, these are temporary annoyances. Eventually, supply will meet demand, and those who want one and can afford one will be able to purchase a new console. However, there are places where the roadblocks to enjoying video games are much larger than just supply shortages. Places where socioeconomic situations have yet to align with the still young yet maturing medium of video games. Places like Brazil. Now, Brazil's gaming landscape is different from what other parts of the world have grown accustomed to, especially ones that have been at the nexus of the industry since its arrival. But just like everyone else, the people of Brazil have a deep love for video games. Throughout the years, they have shown a persistence towards supporting this industry in whatever way they can, regardless of the barriers that stand in their way. For instance, despite ludicrously high prices for video game products, Brazil has become one of the largest gaming markets in the world. While the latest releases of both consoles and games are desirable to the Brazilian consumers, many of them are simply priced out of normal retail purchase. Instead, consumers and companies have had to invent clever ways to circumvent the economic barriers that lie between them and games. For starters, what companies like Atari and Sega would do is license their technology to a Brazilian company so their consoles could be produced within Brazil itself. This resulted in many officially licensed consoles and games coming to the country but under different monikers. But even with some legitimate partnerships springing up, illegal operations ran rampant. Smuggling and piracy, as you can guess, became major avenues by which games and consoles entered the market. Brazilian companies such as CCE, whose Portuguese name translates to Electronic Components Trading, would just outright produce unofficial cartridges of official Sega games. Nintendo grew tired of high taxes in Brazil and ended the distribution of their console and games in the country. However, their products still found their way through one of Brazil's many borders. To this day, smuggled consoles and pirated games are sold in broad daylight. These so-called gray markets are where you can purchase official and unofficial merchandise, while authorities have no issues turning a blind eye. But as time has gone on and the prices for the latest and greatest have remained excessively high, the people of Brazil have gravitated towards consoles that are bordering on ancient in other countries. To this day, the PS2 remains one of the most popular consoles in the country, proving that modern accoutrements aren't necessary for the enjoyment of games. In fact, when the PS2 came to the country 9 years after its initial launch, Netflix supported it with streaming capabilities. Of course, you needed one of those archaic Netflix install discs, but still, it shows that Brazil's gaming culture is recognized as one that is worth supporting. Now, that barely scratches the surface of Brazil's relationship with games from a cultural perspective. I just wanted to give you a quick idea of what it's like in the country before I dive into the next part of this video, which is, how did Brazil get here? While it's certainly fitting, how did this country that houses one of the most diverse natural ecosystems in the world become home to one of the most unique gaming cultures as well? On the most macro of levels, Brazil is massive. It's the 5th largest country in terms of landmass and is home to one of the Earth's most vital ecosystems, the Amazon rainforest. Given its size and the habitats that lie within its borders, Brazil is unfathomably rich in natural resources. As a result, for much of the country's history leading up to the mid-20th century, Brazil had largely relied on the exportation of the resources it could harvest. However, this left the country vulnerable to market volatility anytime major events disrupted the increasingly globalized economy. Events such as the Great Depression and World War II spurred Brazilian officials to restructure their country's economy so as not to be as dependent on outside demand for domestic well-being. In order to accomplish this, Brazil would need to overhaul its manufacturing industries, or rather, the lack thereof. One major instituted policy to achieve this was the Tax on Industrialized Products, or IPI. On paper, this policy aims to incentivize industrial growth within the country by way of heavy taxes on imported goods, refined or raw. This, however, does not mean that goods produced within the country are immune to high taxation rates as well, but they are more affordable nonetheless. This is especially so if the government deems the product a necessary one for the betterment of the country's economy. For example, automobiles saw not only domestic but also foreign support, with Volkswagen, GM, and others opening manufacturing plants in Brazil. While this economic policy incentivizes domestic growth for some industries, it has the ability to seriously hamper others, like video games. Considering Brazil's shift to harboring domestic growth took place in an effort to catch up to more industrialized nations, it seems they prioritized certain industries while others lagged behind. It could be argued that Brazil's government didn't quite see the net value that promoting video games could have. To be fair, from a surface-level perspective, consoles and the games that accompany them are luxury items. So for a country still finding its own industrial footing, it's not surprising they didn't immediately support this particular industry, which was also finding its footing during the latter half of the 20th century. Unfortunately, though, this neglect seemed to verge on outright disdain, as taxes on imported consoles and games became exorbitant. In the most extreme of examples, back when the PS4 launched, it came to retail in Brazil at a staggering $1,845. It was found to be cheaper for a consumer to fly to the US, buy a PS4, and fly back to Brazil than it was to purchase the console outright within the country. The inhibiting stance that the government took did not just have economic repercussions. Brazil, much like other countries, had to grapple with the extreme violence that's present in some video games. In countries like the United States, where horrific school shootings were blamed heavily in part on the effects that violent video games had on the perpetrators leading up to the massacres, Brazilian lawmakers made the same arguments for titles such as Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and the effects they had on its society. Furthermore, given how complicated game and console production is, the previously mentioned factors led to an educational system that provides little in the way of fostering game development talent. While it no doubt exists in the country, there isn't a robust infrastructure to support these kinds of careers. All this is not to say that Brazil's gaming future looks bleak. In fact, some economic and technological developments in recent years seem to indicate the very opposite. The country's president, Bolsonaro, announced a reduction on the importation tax of consoles, accessories, and products with built-in screens. While certainly good news, the import tax, though, is not the only kind that Brazilian consumers must contend with. There are others that substantially contribute to the sky-high prices of video game products, but inroads are being made nonetheless. With these and other changes coming about, the gaming landscape in Brazil is ripening for an upwards trajectory. It's irrefutable that companies are eager to break open the Brazilian market, but a long history of protectionist economic policies have made that a difficult task. However, the persistence of Brazil's gaming community has shown that it is an emerging market with no signs of slowing down. Regardless of which direction this ecosystem goes moving forward, it is a fascinating look at an alternate gaming reality. So, that was a look at Brazil's gaming culture and how it came to be. But why should you care? I mean, sure, the notion of a $2,000 PS4 will pique most people's interest, but that doesn't have anything to do with us here in America, right? Well, I would argue that it does. I've actually known that Brazilians have had to deal with expensive consoles for a little while now. I would see news headlines or hear something on a podcast, but never did I understand the reasons behind it other than just because taxes. I guess what I'm saying is that I never really gave Brazil's situation a second thought in terms of how it relates to someone like me who lives in a country where game and console supply is given top priority. At least that's been the case for as long as I've been alive, but that doesn't mean it will remain that way for the rest of my days. There are deals being struck, markets being opened, corporate interests being turned elsewhere that are changing things. I'm not saying tomorrow, next year, or even 5 years from now that these changes will be eminently noticeable, but they are in motion. I made that video on Tencent a while back, and while I wasn't trying to be critical of the company with that video, that is the sort of thing I'm talking about. I think Tencent is genuinely trying to take over the games industry. Not to sound like a doomsdayer here, but when you see headlines about how Tencent was showing interest in acquiring Take-Two Interactive by way of hostile takeover, then it makes you stop and think about their intentions. Like, yes, obviously money, but beyond that, if they were to have control of Rockstar's handling of the Grand Theft Auto franchise, then I can guarantee you that the GTA 6 we get will be one that Winnie the Pooh approves of. Also, my video on Tencent is blocked in North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and Syria. I don't exactly know why. They say it's because copyrighted music, but a few other videos of mine have copyrighted music and they aren't banned in those countries, so I don't really know, but it doesn't matter. Beyond just the content of our games being changed by external forces, a huge percentage of companies and organizations' financial focus is turning elsewhere. The emerging Asian markets for games and pretty much everything else is just too lucrative of an opportunity for companies to pass up. So now we're seeing American companies placate to foreign interests in the name of profit. Which, look, that's essentially their job. Go to the places and do the things that will make the most money. I just think that eventually, because of this, much like the people of Brazil, people of countries who have enjoyed relative normality in the games world might see some very strange changes come their way due to impactful economic decisions that are completely out of their control. Thanks for watching.